Okay, so I'm going to try and give everyone a sort of, how is it? Okay, give everyone a broad overview to try and understand Singapore, right, and how it works, and particularly the political economy of political, economic, and social control in Singapore. Feel free to interrupt with questions. I think we got over 2 hours. I'm only going to talk for about 45 minutes, and I'm going to paint in very broad brush. So if you have specific issues that you want to ask about, feel free to stop me and ask about them. So just to start with, can I ask how many non-Singaporeans here? Right. Okay. Okay, so most people non-Singaporean. So how confident do you guys feel about understanding Singapore? Like, do you feel like you understand Singapore? Okay. I just asked because I want to know, like, shorthand. If I say things like CPF, is that something everyone understands, or HDB, or so you guys have like that sort of broad level of understanding? Okay. But of course, feel free to interrupt. Okay. So when we think of Singapore, there's sort of a few big myths that we tend to associate with Singapore, right? There's the idea that Singapore is very prosperous, it's very wealthy, right? That it is efficient, there's good governance, especially technocratic governance. There's positive social outcomes that arise from this prosperity and this good governance, right? There's social cohesion, there's racial, religious harmony, and that Singapore is generally free, that it doesn't pretend to be, a democracy like in the Western sort of liberal sense, but that is generally free. That and I think most importantly that because of all these factors, that people endorse the kind of authoritarianism that is carried out by the government. So those are the sort of big broad myths that you tend to get about Singapore, right? And of course, if you guys have any other specific things that you're curious about, that you'd like to ask about, feel free to interrupt. Now, the problem with these myths, of course, is that there's a lot of misunderstandings, that they need to be nuanced, that they need to be understood. So what I'm going to do is try and unpack them a bit, talk a bit about history, the complicated nature of Singaporean governance, but also the causality, right? Singapore is where it is today, not purely, it didn't just arise out of the blue, but there is a lot of history behind the kind of choices that have led us to where we are today. So I'm going to start with a kind of very broad outline, 5 points that I want you to, that we're kind of going to get at today. The first point is that to understand Singapore, you have to understand we're still a colonial country run on colonial lines, right? So not in the formal sense, of course, that there is some sort of foreign government occupying Singapore, but that we still use colonial mechanisms, colonial institutions, colonial values and assumptions to govern Singapore. And as a result of that, that justifies exploitation, especially economic exploitation of our population, of our migrant population, right? It justifies physical control, right? By saying that, the question I get a lot this year is, why are we celebrating 200 years of our own colonialism, of our own colonization? And by celebrating colonialism, you say colonialism is a good thing, it justifies the current government continuing to act and behave in a colonial manner, right? So the first point is that Singapore is still fundamentally a colonial country run on colonial lines. The second is that following colonialism, right, and independence, we actually elected a very staunchly socialist government. And Singapore is also still run very much on those socialist principles, right? Socialism arose out of, post-World War II, and this idea that, I think it was heavily influenced by this idea that if you can use human technology and intellect to change the world, surely you can also use human technology and intellect to build a better society and save the world, right? And so a lot of what you see after World War II is an attempt to actually rationalize our society to create better societies. And to rationalize society, you need to really assert control over it, right? To tear up by the roots all these old structures, these old assumptions, these old values, sweep away a caste system, right? Sweep away discrimination. How do you do that? You need to assert control of society all the way down to the most intimate level of our personal lives, right? And of course, we understand today the excesses of that, of this centrally planned idea of society led to the kind of the excesses we saw in communist countries, right? In China, in the Soviet Union. But that fundamental assumption that a government can make society better by asserting control deeply over every intimate aspect of our lives continues to be the basis on which the PAP governs. So that's the second point. Singapore is still very much a socialist country. The third point is that in Singapore, politics is illegal, right? And by politics, I mean all the very normal, standard things that you would think of as being taking part in politics, right? To speak, right? Freedom of expression, to speak on a political issue, right? To speak on any sort of issue that affects how society is organized and governed, to organize around that issue, to campaign around that issue, right? To protest, to have a meeting like this, right? Even though it's indoors, and even though I am a foreigner speaking in Malaysia, this would be illegal in Singapore, right? Going outside and talking, right? Or even indoors, all of this. So the sort of the PAP over time has made politics itself to be illegal, okay, and limited very sharply to a very narrow sort of pathway in which it has complete control, and thereby through that narrow pathway, it is able to control the entire political process. So, in fact, and I'll get into this later, in Singapore, politics are, it's not just politics which is illegal, but our laws are phrased so broadly that virtually everything is illegal, right? If you leave your house, you are breaking the law. And I'm not exaggerating about that. We'll get back to that. The fourth point is how the government justifies all of this. One way it does this is by asserting a monopoly on national identity, on the idea of the nation. What is the nation? Who are Singaporeans? What are our values? Only the PAP has the right to assert and define national identity. And as a consequence of that, if you disagree with the PAP, or if they don't like you and what you're saying, one of their fundamental claims is always that you are anti-national. You are non-Singaporean, you are subverting the nation, you are subverting the national processes, but more importantly, that means that you are an enemy of the people, right? You're an enemy of the nation. And that then justifies your suppression or even your destruction with extreme prejudice, right? So by monopolizing this idea of the nation, it justifies your being an existential enemy of the people, and thereby justifies detention without trial, right? As some people here know, it justifies, all sorts of measures being taken against you. And the fifth thing I think is really important is that it is very much a country based on form rather than substance. We observe the form of the rule of law, right? Not the spirit. We observe the form of democracy, not the spirit. We observe the form of these institutions of governance, of consultation, but not the spirit. And this allows the Singapore government to then tap into this global rhetoric that supports consultation, that supports democracy, right? That supports the rule of law by saying we have these things, but then it doesn't actually need to observe the spirit of them, right? Why do we have democracy? Well, it's to consult people, it's to hold governments accountable, it's to have transparency, it's to uphold the rights of minorities, right? It's to have a system where you can have trade-offs and compromises between a lot of different interest groups over numerous different issues. And the government, by observing the structure of democracy, the form of democracy, can ignore all these important, aspects of democracy and simply say, oh, we have elections, right? But actually the elections aren't even free and fair, right? They say we have a parliamentary process which is non-consultative, which is not transparent, right? Which is fundamentally a sham, but the government can say internationally, right? Look, we have these things, therefore why is anyone complaining, right? And Singaporeans vote us in every 4 or 5 years, why is anyone complaining? Of course, it's the elections aren't free and fair. Okay, so to understand this, right, these 5 points, before I go on, any questions about the 5 points? No, okay. So to understand these 5 points, I'm going to talk a bit about Singapore history. And to understand the first point in particular, right, that we are still a colonial country, you've got to understand a bit about Singapore history and where we came from. Because after the end of World War II, 1946, the British come back to Singapore and they have decided to decolonize, right? They are settled on this issue of decolonization, and they have become reconciled to the inevitability, and so they're letting all these colonies go, India, Burma, right, in the immediate years after World War II. And they want to leave behind a stable post-colonial state that would support British interests, that would actually support Britain and would continue to service Britain's post-war debt, right? In Malaya, rubber and tin was paying off 50% of, rubber and tin was 50% of Malaya's, the British Empire's US dollar earnings, and the British Empire was massively in debt to the US over the war, right? And this rubber and tin was shipped out through Singapore, right? And Singapore itself, of course, had the port, it had a huge amount of investment, it was the center of British administration throughout Southeast Asia, the most important base east of Suez. So the British wanted a stable post-colonial country. And how do you do that, right? So one way they did that was through physical control. And in Malaya, when the trade unions became too politically aggressive, the British declared the Malayan emergency, right? And this allowed them to assert physical control over Malaya in a very unprecedented way, right? Which they had never done before, but which allowed them, for example, to subordinate individual rights to the needs of the state, cripple institutional restraints on state power, suspend laws which safeguard individual liberty against state oppression. So they could detain without trial, they could ban publications, they could disperse any meeting, they could impose curfews, arrest anybody without warrant, right, etc., etc., etc. But the important point is this, that despite the intentions of the British that these would be temporary, right? This was an emergency situation. These restrictions were supposed to be temporary, but they still exist today. They are codified in the statute books in Singapore and also, to a lesser extent, still in Malaysia, right? And these include things like the Sedition Act, the Internal Security Act, the Criminal Law (Temporary Provisions Act), which, as you can tell from its name, was meant to be very temporary, right? These colonial era laws were designed, rightly or wrongly, to address an armed conflict, right? A civil war. But they're still deployed today to control the population in Singapore. And these establish important precedents. They establish a precedent for an authoritarian state, right? They establish a precedent for the alienability of important principles of rule of law and civil rights. Basically what they're saying is, in times of emergency, you can throw these out, right? But of course, what happens if you never declare the emergency over? And it also establishes the principle of any opposition to state policy as subversion. If you oppose the government, you're subverting the government, therefore we have the right to arrest you and banish you or detain you without trial, lock you up, throw away the key. And these principles still underpin Singapore governance today, right? They're meant to be temporary, should have been formally ended, they're still there today. And they were then maintained, but then also elaborated upon and expanded by the PAP government after it gained power in 1959, and in particular after separation from Malaysia in 1965. So this level of control in Singapore, just physical control alone, right, before we get into the other forms of control, I think it's exceeded only by North Korea, and even North Korea has rural areas that the government doesn't really bother with. Singapore is a tiny island city-state, and the government has this physical control over all of us. But of course, it goes beyond the physical, right? It's also intellectual control. And again, this comes from the colonial period, because the British realized, even if you have a peaceful, stable, post-colonial country, if you want it to be a democracy, people are going to vote for the people, the politicians that represent them, right? So how do you then guarantee that this country remains reliably pro-British? Well, you convert the citizens into British people. How do you do that? Through the education system, through asserting intellectual control, right? Through the control of the terminology, of language, of ideas, right? And so the British embarked on what one academic called the most, the greatest example of social engineering it ever tried in its empire, right? And to, in order to inculcate British values and a British outlook in its citizens, so that those British people, the citizens, the Malayan citizens, would then vote and think of people, vote politicians who thought just like the British. So it also asserted control, right, monopoly over key terminology, such as responsible, moderate, constructive politics, right? Only the British could say what is constructive politics, which means pro-British politics, or at least politics that don't openly oppose the British, right? And again, these same things have been adopted by the PAP government when they talk about what is appropriate, what is moderate, what is constructive, as opposed to what is destructive politics. And then the colonial government also sought control over the media, over the press, right, through censorship. They also sought to shut down the main independent sphere of intellectual thought, which was the Chinese language sphere, right, and eliminate that and cut all sorts of state funding from it, but also slowly try and destroy the schools, destroy the independent school system, destroy the capacity of Chinese language, Chinese-speaking people to organize themselves independently of the government. But most of all, of course, they sought to monopolize the idea of the state, which is what I mentioned earlier, right? By declaring certain things to be Malayan and certain other things to be non-Malayan, they were then able to use that rhetoric to shape how people act and think, right? And then legitimize violence against people who think and act or disagree in a very different way. So, started drawing on this. And then also, they then legitimize illiberal legislation through the form, but not the structure, of democratic consultation, right? So this comes back to the last point I was making, and again, this is something that the British started with, right? So in this way, the colonial authorities could claim rule of law. So they passed, for example, what became the Internal Security Act was passed through Parliament. But of course, the Parliament back then had been was very much sharply limited in terms of the kind of debates that it could have and the kind of people who could be elected to it, for example. Right? So by passing all this illiberal legislation through the form of Parliament, through the form of democratic consultation, but not actual democratic consultation, they thus legitimize acts of oppression. So on the sort of same line, right, we have the creation of institutions and regulations through which the government channels political decisions. This then enables the government to argue that these are technocratic decisions, right? Decisions taken impartially, objectively, by a panel of experts, right? And this is the myth of the technocrat, which I think has been propagated very much by the PAP government. So it promotes the idea of politics as a set of rational public policy decisions, taken on behalf of the people by a set of experts, right, who can sit up there and look down upon us like little gods and who have a big, broad view of what is best for all of us. But the fact is, a lot of these decisions are political decisions, right? They are based on clashing interests. They are based on political alliances. They are based on collective action, horse trading, conflict between different value-laden perspectives, right? And the biggest example of this, I think, is detention without trial. Because obviously, detention without trial has been made very clear over the years, and even by Lee Kuan Yew in his own autobiography, a lot of it was people were arrested because they were political opponents, right? There was trading off between him and Tunku Abdul Rahman about who to arrest on both sides of the causeway, right? All of these this is political, but publicly, right? They said, oh, us politicians, we actually don't want to do the arrests. It's actually special branch. It's these experts who wrote a report based on their studies and submitted it to us and say, we must arrest these people. You see? So again, if you think about a lot of the policy decisions made by the Singapore government, they'll always say it's by a certain group of experts, by a stat board, by civil servants who are impartial, right? But all of these decisions, you look at them, they're actually political decisions which actually require trading off between a lot of different interests and values. But by presenting it this way, the government can say, we are impartial. And this not only sells the decision, right, by saying it's by experts, but it allows the government to avoid responsibility for making those decisions. Now, all of this, right, the People's Action Party actually campaigned against most of this when it was in opposition. But of course, when they were elected in 1959, they soon realized that a lot of these things make it very much easier to govern, right? If you don't have opposition, if you don't have inconvenient voices. And this led to a split within the PAP, where there were those who were against these sort of levers, these sort of very illiberal, oppressive legislation and institutions and structures on principle that they were wrong. And then a different group within the PAP whose objection to these very liberal, oppressive levers and structures was that they were being held and used by foreigners, not by Singaporeans. And so the PAP split on those lines, and the smaller rump of the PAP, which is still the PAP today, were those who said this sort of thing is fine, right? This illiberal oppression is fine as long as it's Singaporeans in charge. And the bigger part were those who were against all this in principle. Now, the bigger part, of course, then became the opposition Barisan Socialists, right? Which then looked like it was going to win the 1963 elections. So, in trying to hold on to power, the PAP faced a lot of the same problems as the British, right? The only sort of coherent and consistent nationalist force was actually led by the Barisan. It was the Chinese-speaking, trade union-based nationalist movement. And in order to destroy this, the PAP really returns to and uses all these levers of oppression that I talked about, right? Control of physical, the physical landscape, control of the intellectual landscape, control of society, right? And they pass all this through the form, but not the substance of democracy. And they normalize the idea of the, emergency rule, right, through this rhetoric of vulnerability, through a rhetoric of constant external threats, and they kind of normalize all these authoritarianism, the subordination of individual rights to the needs of the state, the suspension of laws that safeguard individual liberty, right? All of this is suspended and normalized, and they return to painting any opposition to the PAP as anti-national by asserting a monopoly over the state. And this becomes the template through which the PAP governs. And they use this to then defeat the Barisan in 1963 by controlling the terms of merger, by going to the Tunku and working out with him a template for merger that was advantageous to the PAP, and then saying any opposition to merger, therefore, is anti-Malayan, anti-national, and therefore we must destroy these people because they are enemies of the state, they are going to destroy us. And that justifies the arrest and detention of Singapore's political opposition throughout 1963, right? Most famously, Operation Coal Store in February. But then after that, the PAP actually expands and elaborates on these as it tries to implement its new socialist vision for Singapore, right? It wants to move past the British colonial economy and society to create a new Singapore, right? And to its credit, right, it had a strong vision that it was pursuing. But in order to do this, it really had to assert control far beyond what the British colonial government had. So Initially, of course, some of this takes very tried and true, tested forms. It turns Parliament into a rubber stamp, it bans opposition rallies, it deregisters societies, it expels students, it declares legitimate political activities to be illegal, it uses the Sedition Act, there's arrests of opposition politicians, there's lawsuits, they're detained without trial, right? They assert control over the intellectual space, they say only the PAP has the right to define identity, nation, values, they shut down newspapers which publish editorials they don't agree with, right? They close down all this space for political organization, but then they go beyond that, right? And they discard principles of human rights and democracy and accountability that even the British colonial government had observed, even in the breach. So for example, the idea that a law, the punishment for a law should be proportional to the punishment for a crime should be proportional to the crime, right? This was discarded in 1966 with the Punishment for Vandalism Act. Now, if you, those of you who know about Jolovan Wam's case, right, he was recently convicted under this act. And what the Punishment for Vandalism Act does is it doesn't actually criminalize damage to public property, right? If you think about vandalism, what is vandalism? Damaging property. The Punishment for Vandalism Act doesn't address that. The Punishment for Vandalism Act really, what it really addresses is communication of information. That's what it's meant to criminalize. Because what happens in '66 is that the PAP was supporting the the war in Vietnam, right? The Americans in the war in Vietnam. And the Barisan were against it. And the PAP used all their normal tactics, shut down meetings, prevent rallies, right? Deregister. And opposition politicians were still resorting to trying to get their message out. They were resorting to sneaking out and putting up posters or painting signs, right, explaining why the Vietnam War was immoral, why Singapore should not support the Americans, you know, or at most, as most crude, they have signs saying Yankee go home, because American servicemen were holidaying in Singapore. So the PAP changed the law, and we're very clear about this. Lee Kuan Yew said, you know, we're changing this law to prevent, you know, this sort of political behavior, right? Up to that point in time, vandalism was a fine, right? $50, you know, commensurate with the damage you do. But after that, it became several $1,000s, several years in jail, and I think it's 6 to 8 strokes of the cane, right? With the idea that you use humiliation to break the spirit of the opposition. So totally disproportionate to the crime, right? And so this is one of many such legislation where first of all, right, the legislation is reworded to criminalize political activity. Second, by, you know, you give it a sort of form that is internationally recognizable but actually targets something else, right? I mean, as you remember with Michael Fay, you know, the law was used against him, right, and he was convicted under it. And the whole rhetoric was, well, of course, vandalism is wrong, and, you know, therefore he should be caned for it, right? And you know, this became internationally understood as, you know, punishment for vandalism, right? But of course, Michael Fay was not actually who the law was originally aimed at. It was aimed at opposition politicians and activists. And so you can go around the world saying, what? You're saying, you know, if anyone objects, you say, what, vandalism? You want to endorse vandalism? No, of course not. No one's endorsing vandalism, right? So it's a sort of, by deliberately changing the definition, you can get away with this sleight of hand. So another thing that they did was they introduced the 1974 Newspaper and Printing Presses Act, which elaborated on forms of social control, right? And this actually became a sort of model for legislation elsewhere or action elsewhere, because what the PAP did was they forced all the newspapers into government-approved ownership by saying that broadcast and print media can only be owned by people approved by the government fundamentally, right? They created different classes of shares, they consolidated ownership into a single company, Singapore Press Holdings, which the government then had the right to appoint management, right? And so this creates a structure where there's no need for active censorship, because the people appointed already are in favor of the government. So Marcos tried to do this, but wasn't able to get the legislation through. So basically what he did was take newspaper owners and force them to sell to his friends, right? And Duterte is doing the same thing. The Inquirer, for example, right? He forced the Prieto family to sell to his crony. And so it's the same sort of thing. Ensure that the media is held by people favorable to you. But the Newspaper and Printing Presses Act also forces ownership to be diluted, right, among a wide variety of people, institutional investors who are, of course, more conservative and more focused on profit than on having a singular voice, right? So by applying these sort of neoliberal tactics on commercial entities, it enables the government to then dilute any sort of singular voice among the media. And of course, in 1980, the government was able to achieve control over education and end Chinese language education through ending vernacular education. All education must be in English, and then also forcing the Nanyang University, which is taught in Chinese, to close and merge with the University of Singapore. Right? So this was done on the grounds of quote-unquote national development, but of course ends a bastion of oppositional organization against the government. Okay, so what is this all for, right? I've talked about control, physical control, intellectual control. Why is the PAP doing this? And we come back to socialism, which is what I was talking about, my second point earlier. Now, to understand this, right, we need to take a step back and understand where Singapore is coming from. Because in 1930, Singapore was the richest country in Asia, right? There is a myth that Singapore was poor. Singapore wasn't poor. Singapore was a very, very, very rich place. The only place richer in Asia was metropolitan Tokyo, right? Which is also a city, I suppose. But Singapore in the 30s, and then again in the 50s after the war, had all the things that we associate with Singapore, right? Tall buildings, wide boulevards, more motor cars per capita than anywhere in Asia, clean drinking water, right? Efficient public transport that was, it was largely private owned, but it was generally pretty reasonably priced. And it had a very high level of average income. So you guys familiar mean, median, and mode, right? The mean income in Singapore in 1957 was $1,100 million, right? But the modal income, right, the middle number, and the modal income, the most common number, and the median income, the middle number, was the same as the poverty line, which was about $100 million. So the rich back then was so rich that they pulled up the average income from 100, which is the poverty line, to 1,100, right? And that's because all this wealth was held in the hands of a tiny European and Asian elite, right? And that's the structure of Singapore society back then. We didn't have labor rights, we didn't have working rights, we didn't have human rights. There was a lot of unemployment, there was a huge population boom, trade unions had very little strength. So employers could exploit people to a very great extent, right? Hire people, pay them next to nothing, and if they're unhappy, just fire them and hire someone else. See, and that's the structure of a colonial and exploitative colonial society, because that maximizes capitalist profitability. That's what the British cared about. So when the Labour Front was elected in 1955 and then the PAP in 59, that was what they were elected by the majority of Singaporeans, by workers, to address, right? Not poverty per se, but inequality. Because these workers could see rich tycoons, tauques, right, Europeans, living in massive houses. They could see broad streets, really clean, right, beautiful lighting, right, landscaping, right? They could see that. They were living right, like a few hundred meters away, right, in slums, on the edges of the city, or in the city, 30, 40, 50, 60 people even to a single building, right? They were sleeping under bridges, in boats, at their workplaces, all for the sake of this capitalist profitability. So that's why they elected socialist governments which promised to address inequality by creating a more meritocratic society, a fairer society, by expanding opportunity. And that's what the PAP did, and that's what it was very successful at addressing, especially in creating public housing, right? So when people think about Singapore and its great successes, They think of the CPF, they think of HDB, they think of industrialization, they think of healthcare, they think of public transport, and all of these were implemented by a socialist government between the mid-60s and the late 70s in pursuit of this ideal, right? Spreading out opportunity. See, that's what the PAP was trying to assert control over, and that's what it was trying to remove opposition towards. Because, of course, to achieve this, you need really to, and if you want to do it quickly, you need to overcome a lot of barriers. If you want to build lots of shiny new housing, HDB flats, you got to clear out the kampongs, right? You got to forcibly repossess land. And if people have democratic rights, they're going to stop you, right? Because they might have lived in those, shacks, atap huts or whatever, for generations even, right? So in order to achieve this, right, the PAP asserted socialist, these socialist aims, it asserted physical control, right? If you want to get people to have better living standards and change their lives quickly, right, you need to intervene very much into their actual physical existence, right, and force them, to undergo health checks, to undergo vaccinations, right, to make it a crime not to have a vaccine or to go see a doctor, right. If you want to end discrimination, right, you can't just pass a law that ends discrimination. You have to, that'll take forever. If you want to do it quickly, you actually have to intervene into how people think, right, and force them to act and think in very different ways. And that's how the PAP was able to achieve this miracle that we think of, third world to first in one generation. It's not just about inequality, right? It's a change of our lives and how we see ourselves, how we see our society, how we behave, right? Through the kind of physical and intellectual levers that I talked about, right? And of course, most importantly, industrialization. If you want to train up labor, educate it, industrialize quickly, right? You need labor discipline. You can't have trade unions protesting, right? You can't have people demanding a fair wage and slowing down industrialization, right? You need to control labor and negotiate with it, hopefully negotiate or ultimately impose conditions on it through the trade unions. If you want to crush crime, right, very rapidly, and you don't want to think about the social issues that underpin crime, right? If you want to just end drugs, just shoot everyone who do drugs, right? And that's what we still do today. We just hang people who are involved in drugs, right? Of course, there's a lot of controversy, especially since one's race seems to have a very big impact on whether one gets hanged or one gets kicked out of the country, or whether one gets punished or not. And one's class has a big determinant of this. But this attitude fundamentally comes from the 60s and 70s, where the PAP just wanted to get rid of crime, and so it imposed these very draconian measures to just end crime through this control of society, right? Rather than think about what are the social causes of crime, right? They didn't have time for that. They didn't want to bother that. Just end it, you see? So as long as you're actually making things better, building houses, right, raising incomes, making living standards better, reducing inequality, ending crime, you can get away with this because the majority of people will back you, right? But what happens in the late 70s and into the early 80s was a series of massive policy failures once all the low-hanging fruit was plucked, right? And there's no time to go into it all, but basically there was massive recessions in the early 80s, the prices of housing skyrocketed, right? A lot of people found their mortgages underwater, CPF was reconfigured, education system was drastically changed, right? And this part of this was towards this goal of making Singapore more efficient, right? Once you get rid of, you've already plucked the low-hanging fruit, how do you optimize a society for higher living standards and for greater, wealth, right? And you need to assert even more control to the point where Singaporeans were getting really, really unhappy, especially when it turned out to be a big failure and there was a big recession in the mid-80s. And, and of course, the ending of Chinese language education and the changing of the education system I talked about, right? So it was towards this vision that they asserted greater control and failed. And in response to that, the PAP abandoned further attempts to address inequality on this basis and reverted Singapore to what was fundamentally competition based on wage, a colonial economy, right? They were trying to transition Singapore to sort of high value, high wage economy and couldn't do it. And because fundamentally you can't renegotiate your position in the global economy but just through domestic legislation, right? And foreign investment came and said, when now your workers are so expensive. So foreign investment plunged in Singapore by a third, right? And there was a recession, Singaporeans got upset, we elected JBJ, our first opposition politician in 81, followed by Cham Si Tong in 84. The PAP freaked out, said forget it, went back to a low wage, sort of neo-colonial model of capitalism. But also, they then asserted deep control over the electoral system. Right? Up to that point in time, they didn't interfere with the electoral system itself, but really what they did was simply arrest and detain opposition politicians before the elections. But from the mid-80s, they basically rigged the whole election system, and as a result of the opposition gaining 2 MPs out of 75, right? That's how freaked out they were. Just 2 opposition MPs out of 75, and they changed the whole electoral system. So you got the GRCs, which you guys are familiar with, right? A slate of opposition MPs instead of 1, right? Gerrymandering, malapportionment, where some wards, like PAP wards, are significantly smaller than opposition wards, so it takes more opposition voters to elect an opposition politician than it takes PAP voters to elect PAP politician. You have the creation of town councils, which are mapped on the constituencies for the express purpose, as Lee Kuan Yew said in Parliament, of punishing constituencies which vote opposition by depriving them of public services, right? So people know if you vote opposition, you will get punished through the town council. As Aljunied found out in 2011, the day after the election, the PAP lost those 6 seats. And the day after, all these public playing fields and badminton halls, multi-purpose halls, all this public infrastructure was suddenly shuttered and withdrawn and handed over to the People's Association, and so playing fields that you'd been using for years suddenly no longer accessible and is now held by, the People's Association, right, rather than your own town council. Yeah, well, the chair of the People's Association is the Prime Minister, right? So it's supposedly independent, but of course it was created in the 50s as a sort of, the 60s, as a government-funded version of, to try and organize the grassroots, right? The Barisan had the trade unions, they had student associations, they had cultural language associations, and the PAP used government resources to create these institutions to organize grassroots along the same lines to try and mobilize their, ground support. So what you have in this period is then even more control, right? And you have a last big hurrah of arrests, which of course we have, Operation Spectrum and, Kenneth left here, I forget where, yeah, but you're here, and yeah, Operation Spectrum in the mid-80s. You have the ending of the ability of the Law Society to comment on legislation. You have the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act to keep religious organizations out of politics, right? Lee Kuan Yew was very worried about the strength of the Catholic Church in the Philippines, overthrowing Marcos, in Korea, liberation theology. So all of these laws, right, to ensure that politics becomes narrower and narrower to a pathway that the PAP can control, right? And the whole, economy shifting back to a very neo-colonial model, right? So, let's see, let me just skip ahead. Gerrymandering and, okay. So, last, but I think most significantly, is the introduction of a whole new narrative of Singapore history, right, in the mid-90s. From post-46, when we were partitioned, when Malaya was partitioned and Singapore was split from the rest of Malaya, until 1965, all the main parties in Singapore, including the PAP, pursued this line that Singapore is part of Malaya, we are Malayan, our history is Malayan, and this is our national identity. Post-separation, right, they suddenly found that, we got to justify this idea of Singapore not being part of Malaya, not being part of Malaysia. So Rajaratnam says, we have no history, forget our history, we are the new people, new society, right, we're going to create a new idealized society. And then once you have all these reverses in the 80s and the PAP says, hey, people aren't being grateful to us, right? So they create a new narrative for Singapore history, but they can't link it to our Malayan past, right? The deeper, sort of more fundamental roots of Singapore. So they link it to the colonial past. And the first Singapore history textbook comes out in '84, and it's Singapore history, 1819 to 1965, and has a picture of Raffles, the Raffles statue on the cover. And they elaborate on this and develop this until the mid-90s. They come up with the Singapore story, which basically is the PAP story, the Lee Kuan Yew story, right? And they start changing all these things in Singapore history. The example I like to point out is Religious Harmony Day, which takes place on the anniversary of the 1964 riots, which were on the Prophet Muhammad's birthday. And between 64 and 96, the PAP says, oh, these riots are political riots. They were caused by agents provocateur coming from KL, right, to disrupt our lives in Singapore and, unsettle, subvert the government. Suddenly in 1997, these riots become racial riots, religious riots, right? And we must be afraid of religious disharmony. And Religious Harmony Day is celebrated for the first time in '97. So it fundamentally changes its own reading of history to suit what it perceives as the new enemies, which would be religious organizations organizing independently of the government, right, and agitating for issues and using its massive grassroots base to organize against the government, you see. So again, right, you see this control extends to intellectual control. So since then, right, Lee Kuan Yew retires in 1990. You have Goh Chok Tong until 2004, Lee Hsien Loong from 2004 until today, right? And you can see the broad patterns of Singapore deriving from this whole period in the mid-80s to the mid-90s, and the continued control of the intellectual and physical landscape, right? And today, as the PAP's popularity wanes and as its legitimacy is increasingly called into question, it continues to lean very much on this reading of history, but it's also continued to elaborate on these forms of social control, right? So we talked about the depoliticization of politics, right? And so increasingly political decisions are shifted onto administrative bodies. We talked about the form rather than the structure, and of course we have the infamous Select Committee on Fake News from last year, which as it turned out, right, they blew it up themselves by demonstrating that it was more about trying to legitimate legislation which they already have in mind, rather than as an exercise in consultation, right? And they vastly increased the scope of criminal laws. So since 2006 or so, the PAP have expanded the definition of what is illegal so broadly that we come back to what I said earlier, leaving your house is illegal, right? Because an illegal procession, for example, is one person. So if you are walking down the street and the government decides that it is a political procession, they can arrest you. And that's what happened to Silan Pillay, whose works I believe you can see in the exhibition, right? He basically walked from Hong Lim Park to Parliament carrying a mirror, didn't get anyone's way, didn't cause a disturbance, stands on the public sidewalk in front of Parliament. They arrest him, they convict him of illegal procession. One man, send him to jail, 2 weeks, right? An illegal assembly is one person. And also, if you are just standing somewhere, they can arrest you and convict you of an illegal assembly, right? So leaving your house it can be a criminal act. But even if you're in your house, you're not safe, right? The Films Act. Under the Films Act, political films are banned. What is a political film, right? It could be anything. It could be one of my videos. It could be this video right here. If you watch this video, it's a political film. And the IMDA's representatives, without a warrant, merely on suspicion that you've been seeing a political film, can enter your house and confiscate the equipment on which you have been watching that political film. Merely on suspicion, no proof needed, no warrant needed. They just come in and they take your phone, your laptop, your TV, whatever, they confiscate it all. And they'll, what happened, for example, to some activists, Teo So Lang, for example, whom I think was also here, they hold it for a year and a half, right? Inconvenience you, maybe damage your stuff by accident, I don't know. Then at the end of it, they say, oh, okay, we're not going to prosecute you, we'll let you have a warning, here's your stuff back. And then the government, if anyone protests, the government will say, what? We didn't convict, we didn't charge them. We have to investigate, right? There was a suspicion of, wrongdoing here. Of course we must investigate. Are you saying that we cannot uphold rule of law? Are you saying the police cannot do their job, right? So they use the administration of justice to come after you, right? And to grind you down and make your life difficult, right? So it comes back to what I'm saying, the form rather than the substance. The form of protection of the law used to grind us down rather than the substance of the protection of the law, which is meant to protect individual liberty. So increased legislation includes the Public Order Act of 2009, Protection of Harassment Act 2013, amendments to the Government's Proceeding Act, amendments to the Broadcasting Class License Notification 2013, Public Entertainments and Meetings Act 2014, Protection of Justice Administration Act 2016, Films Act 2018, amendments to the Films Act 2018, Public Order and Safety Special Powers Act 2018, and we've got an impending fake news bill coming. Who knows what's going to be in that? All these laws have a certain thing in common. They increase the arbitrary power held by the executive branch of government or make it harder for people to challenge those decisions using what should be normal channels, for example, lawsuits or going through different consultative channels. And they limit the ability of non-PAP, non-state actors to speak. They increase the cost of legal challenges, right? And they create exemptions for the government. So all these things, right, there are specific exemptions for the government while they enable policy decisions to be presented as rational public policy decisions, right? So for example, I talked about you walking down the street being, illegal. Who decides that? Well, the Attorney General is the Prime Minister's former personal lawyer, right? And he was appointed I think it was at age 65, which is 2 years above the constitutional limit, right? So he was unconstitutionally appointed, but he's there, right? And then who is the Deputy Attorney General? It's a former PAP party member, you see. But when these people make decisions, the PAP can say, the politicians can say, hey, it's not us, right? It's these experts making a decision about whether this is a crime or not. So, so in a nutshell, right, this is, to come back to my big 5 points, right? You can see that Singapore is still very much governed colonial lines. We still have very much a colonially based economy, neo-colonial, based on low-cost labor, justifies the exploitation of labor, right? Our Prime Minister talks about if we don't behave, foreign investment will go elsewhere, right? And then he says, oh, but we don't want foreign funding because of domestic interference, without actually seeing the whole contradiction in what he's saying, right? Singaporeans must tighten our belts so that foreigners can increase their profits in Singapore, but foreigners shouldn't accept foreign money for any other reason, including promoting democracy or whatever, right? And then we have a government also organized geared towards, with levers of power, towards socialist outcomes, right? Optimizing our society and, the ability to influence where you live, who you marry, what your job is, even your definition of self, right? What race you are has to fit into the government definition, right? Politically, they can even say, as, some people have encountered that, you are not Indian, you are Malay, or vice versa, right? For example, the government has the right to do that. And, yeah, no, not just the president, actually, for GRCs, you also need a certificate to say that you're a minority for GRCs, right? It's never been controversial thus far until the presidency, but actually that has goes back to the 80s. So they can redefine your race, right? And of course, all of this authoritarian, draconian legislation, all of this is passed through the form rather than the substance of democracy. And to finish off, right, the most common question I get, right, the number one question I get about Singapore is, well, but surely you can't disagree that this has worked. Singapore is rich. Singaporeans are well off. And my response always is, how do you know? First of all, we don't have freedom of information. Statistics come from the government, right? The only things that we know are things that the government tells us. They specifically declassify. All government information is a state secret. By definition, they declassify what they want to tell us, right? So we have no way to know that the outcomes that we're seeing are actually, what the government says they are, right? And if the outcomes are so fantastic, why can't we have this data declassified and released and have independent experts evaluating how fantastic our lives are? And second of all, if Singaporeans do accept this, why don't we have free and fair elections, right? Why does the government need to so blatantly rig elections, the presidency of course being one, but also our general election every 5 years, to the point where you cannot say that there is a real reflection of public opinion on the government, nor is there any sort of accountability or transparency through the electoral system. So we don't dispute that the PAP has done marvels for Singapore and has increased our living standards and really tackled inequality over the years through these levers. But the problem is it really everything they say it is? And we don't really have a choice in all of this. And so because of that, it's impossible to actually have an informed opinion about what's going on in Singapore because of all this control.